Hey there Windowers, and welcome to another episode of Windows on Windows. And in this special episode of Windows on Windows, I'm going to be talking about how Microsoft actually names Windows and what the next version of Windows might be called. So we're going to have a look at these three questions. So how has Microsoft named past Windows releases? What are the most likely names for the next version of Windows? And how might Microsoft decide on names for future Windows releases? And if you're wondering where all this started, on Twitter on the 2nd of June 2021, Panos Panay, who is the Chief Product Officer for Windows, posted a tweet saying that he was looking forward to June the 24th and that he hopes we'll join him with the hashtag Microsoft event. Now he posted a URL. If you follow the URL, it takes you to a page that is advertising a Windows event. And Panos' tweet was followed shortly afterwards by a tweet from the official Windows account itself saying a similar thing: join us on June the 24th at 11 AM ET for the Microsoft event to see what's next. And it's accompanied by an animation, and the animation appears to show a Microsoft logo with light coming through the logo in the shape of an 11. So at the moment, speculation is rife that actually we may be very close to a new major release of the Windows operating system. Obviously it's been 6 years since we got Windows 10, which was the last major release, and at the time of Windows 10's release we were told that it would be the last version of Windows, that Windows would be moving to Windows as a service, which is what Microsoft called it at the time, meaning that Windows 10 would be the last version in name, and all future versions or all future updates would just be basically put on top of Windows 10. However, it does seem that it's very possible that now, 6 years down the road, Microsoft may have changed their minds and changed their strategy here. So let's have a little think about, firstly, what sort of things Microsoft used to do in naming Windows and how that can maybe help us work out what this new version, if indeed it is a new version of Windows, may actually be called. So how have Microsoft named Windows releases in the past? Well, firstly, if we go all the way back to the very beginning of Windows, so that's around 1985 with the first release, and from that first release of Windows, for around the next decade, Windows releases were named using version numbers. So they each had a kernel version, and the official names just corresponded to those kernel version numbers. So for example, Windows 1.0, which came out in 1985, Windows 2.0 in 1987, and Windows 3.1 in 1992, and there are other versions as well. And the last release of Windows to use this naming strategy was Windows NT 4.0, which came out in 1996. And Windows NT, by the way, in case you're not sure what that is, that was just basically a new branch of Windows that was initially marketed towards businesses, and it came with things like security improvements. Eventually, the Windows NT line was amalgamated back into the main Windows line with Windows XP, and since Windows XP, everyone's been using Windows NT, including consumers. So from 1995 to the year 2000, the naming strategy for Windows changed, and instead of using kernel version numbers, Microsoft decided, for reasons that are today unknown, to switch their release names to correspond to the years in which the operating systems were released. And this includes Windows 95, which came out in obviously 1995, Windows 98, and Windows 2000. And depending on your point of view, there may be a couple of exceptions. We have Windows 98 Second Edition, which came out in 1999, which, like I said, depending on your point of view, you may consider as actually not a new version of Windows at all. You may consider it as just an iteration of Windows 98. And Windows Millennium Edition, which again you may consider does not strictly follow the year of release strategy because it doesn't have the year 2000 in it. However, my personal opinion is that it does, because Millennium in the name is obviously signifying the year 2000, and Microsoft had already used the name Windows 2000 for the new version of Windows NT at the time, so they obviously couldn't use the same name again for the consumer versions, and I think that's why they went with Millennium. So then from about 2001, when Windows XP came out, Microsoft were looking to reinvent Windows again. So they'd already done it once with Windows 95, and that had introduced things like the start menu, the taskbar, and so on. And with Windows XP, like I mentioned earlier, this was the first release of Windows NT that was targeted at consumers as well as businesses. So again, Microsoft were looking to reinvent Windows a little bit. So with XP, we obviously had a big change in visual style. We had the new blue and green Luna theme name, for example, and we did away with Windows Classic, at least by default, Microsoft gave consumers a default desktop wallpaper background for the first time ever, which was known as Bliss, that you can see in the background here. So as part of that reinvention, they wanted to change how they named Windows. And like I said, and as we all know today, very famously, they went with Windows XP. So this was a nickname, or you may call it a moniker, and that was followed quite a long time later actually, and there's a whole story about this. Check out my Windows Vista development series if you want to know why Windows Vista took so long. But a long 6 years later, Windows Vista came out, and obviously that also has a nickname, much like macOS does today. Now, one interesting thing is that server releases of Windows, so these are releases that were not targeted at consumers, these even today actually still use the year of release strategy. So Windows Server 2003, for example, even in this time when XP and Vista had a different naming strategy. And that brings us to 2009, so this saw the release of Windows 7, and this marked again another change in how Microsoft went about naming Windows. So from this point, and this is still true today, consumer versions of Windows were given numeric names, and the names did not initially correspond to the version numbers. And this includes Windows 7 from 2009, like I said, Windows 8, Windows 8.1, and Windows 10. So Windows 7, for example, had a kernel version of 6.1, Windows 8 was 6.2, Windows 8.1 was 6.3. Now Windows 10, during its initial development, that was given a kernel version number of 6.4. However, when it was eventually released in 2015, Microsoft actually bumped that kernel version number all the way up to 10 to actually get rid of that discrepancy and to bring the versioning back into line with the actual names. And like I said a minute ago, even during this time, and it's still true today, Windows Server versions still follow the year of release naming strategy. So that's a very quick overview of how Microsoft have gone about naming Windows in the past. So now let's think about how might they go about naming this apparent next version of Windows that, like I said, apparently is very, very close. We're only a few weeks away from this announcement. So let's think about possible strategies. So the most obvious one, maybe, would just be to continue using the Windows 10 name. And like I said earlier, this would follow what Microsoft said the plan was. Upon the release of Windows 10, they said it would be the last version of Windows, and all future updates or future releases would just be applied on top of the existing Windows 10. So this would seem to go with what Microsoft themselves have said, and you might argue it would be the easiest thing to do. So, for example, we may see a release of Windows 10 2021 update. And actually, this would not be any different really to how Microsoft have been naming Windows releases over the last 6 years or so. So during this time that we've had Windows 10 and we've had Windows as a service, as Microsoft call it, the updates that Microsoft have been releasing, which has been roughly twice a year, have had various names. We've had, for example, the Windows 10 Creators Update, we've had the Fall Creators Update, and lots of different names. So this could just be another iteration of that same strategy. So it may not be the Windows 10 2021 update, that's just my example, but you get what I mean. Now, another thing that Microsoft could do, and this is not much of a stretch, is they could choose to increment the numeral, so just take it all the way up to Windows 11. And like I said, that's not much of a stretch of the imagination. It would logically make sense, especially if they were looking to introduce maybe some larger new features or larger visual overhauls, which we do know is coming, and that is something called Sun Valley, which you can find out a lot more about on Twitter, on Google, and so on. And another, probably less likely thing that they could do is either come up with a new naming strategy or re-adopt a previous one. Now the consensus at the moment, so this is in early June 2021, so we're before this June the 24th Windows event, the majority of people online are either predicting that this will be Windows 11, and there is quite a bit of evidence that points towards this. For example, that animation that I talked about earlier, that Panos tweeted, and you can see in the background here, or, and quite a lot of people think this as well, they may just actually get rid of the version numbers altogether and just call it Windows. However, I do personally have an issue with this because I think it can complicate things. So imagine, for example, people that work in technical support having to help people that, are not very technically minded, all they know is that they're using Windows. They don't know what version they're using. That would cause potential problems for things like tech support, like I've just said, where people would not be able to actually communicate easily what version of the operating system they were actually running. And this would be more of a problem in the near future, and that's because we still have old versions of Windows in support for a little while longer. For example, Windows 8 and Windows 8.1, they're still in support for quite a few years yet. So we still do have a small spread of different versions of Windows. Obviously, in the more distant future, this would be less of a problem. So for example, when Windows 8 and Windows 8.1 go out of support and we've only got Windows 10 and or Windows 11, but let's not go there again. This could be easier when everyone's on a base kernel of 10, for example, and it's 10 or 10.1 or 10.2, then it could be actually a lot easier, and this would make potentially more sense, I think, a bit later in the future. I think at this point it's a little bit too early still. Now, there is also a problem with Windows 11, although arguably less of a problem. This would seem to go against Microsoft's declaration that Windows 10 would be the last version of Windows. But remember, this was 6 years ago, which in terms of operating systems and technology is quite a long time. And during that time, we've had a lot of changes in the people that are looking after Windows at Microsoft. We've had a lot of changes in staff, a lot of restructuring, and we've actually got a completely different team at this point looking after Windows. So actually, does it really matter? Does it actually matter? It was a long time ago, and 6 years, like I said, in technology, that is a long time for things to change. So at this point, would it really matter that they said, initially it's going to be the last version of Windows? So with that in mind, continuing to use the name Windows 10, you may think might be the easiest option for Microsoft. They'd not have any problems with going against what they've already said. But you do have to think as well, would it be the wisest option? So we've had a lot of controversy with Windows 10. We've had a lot of bad updates going out, update sagas, deleting users' files, for example. We're seeing a lot of people move away from Windows actually and going towards other operating systems such as Chrome OS and Mac OS as well. So you may think actually, Microsoft at this point, just like after Windows 8 came out really, seeing some of this negative reception and realizing some of the mistakes that they've made, they may actually want to change their strategy in naming Windows just to illustrate and really highlight that, they are taking this seriously and they are giving us a very big update. Okay, so again, that was a quick overview of what the most likely names are for this upcoming release of Windows. But now let's have a quick think about as well how Microsoft may decide to name future versions of Windows, if indeed there will be any future versions. So really, they've got two options. They could either resurrect a previous strategy, for example using monikers, or they could employ a new strategy. Now let's have a think about reusing old strategies to start with. Now, like I mentioned earlier, for Windows 10, Microsoft actually bumped the kernel version number in order to make it correspond with the numeral used in the name. So for example, we had Windows 7, which was version 6.1, Windows 8 was version 6.2, Windows 8.1 was version 6.3, and with Windows 10, upon release, it was given the version number 10 or 10.0 rather than 6.4. So at this point, the kernel version numbers do now correspond to the numerals used in the names. So if Microsoft did decide to go back to using kernel version numbers, that would work just fine. So we could have, for example, Windows 10.1, which could be given the kernel version 10.1, and Windows 10.2 after that, and so on. Now, in terms of other strategies, years of release would also work and still be valid, at least up to 2095, but obviously that is a very long time in the future, especially, like I've said, for technology. So Windows 2021 would appear to work, so would Windows 21, and that would be akin to how Windows 95, for example, was named, with just the last part of the release year in the name. And obviously monikers would also work as well, so Windows Nova, for example, that would work too. So then in terms of new strategies, really you have to ask realistically, what other strategies are there apart from the ones that they've already used? And the only one that I could really think of is part using names of previous versions. So for example, we could have maybe Windows 10 Next or Windows 10 Second Edition, and these are not as far-fetched as you might initially think. Windows 98, as I mentioned earlier, had a Second Edition, or Windows 98 SE. Microsoft were up to very recently working on a new, lighter version of Windows called Windows 10X, which has now been cancelled, but again, 10X was a name that they did use. And like I mentioned earlier, and a lot of people seem to be fans of online, Microsoft may choose to make no distinction between future versions and simply in marketing, for example, just refer to it as Windows. And like I went into a bit more detail on earlier, I think this could make sense, but definitely not in the near future. So there we go, that is a very short overview of how Microsoft may decide to name versions of Windows into the future. One last thing for you to think about before I go is this. What would you name the next version of Windows and why? So if you were working with Panos, if you were in that Windows team working on this next version, what would be your personal choice for a name for Windows and why? So please do let me know in the comments what your ideas are for what Microsoft could call the next version of Windows, and also maybe what you would like to call the next version of Windows if you had an input in what it should be called. So I hope you've enjoyed this quite short but hopefully entertaining and maybe educational episode of Windows on Windows. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.